welcome. Tonight, we step back into the age of the Tudors to explore what life was like inside a royal palace. From the quiet work of servants before dawn to the bustle of courtiers around the king, every hour of the day held its own rhythm. Together, we will move gently through the palace, meeting the many people who kept it alive, and listening as the day slowly turns to night. So, settle in. Let the sounds of the past surround you, and allow the story of a day in the Tudor court to guide you toward rest. Let us begin. The palace stirred long before the king. In the dark corridors, footsteps echoed softly as the yeomen of the chamber began their work. They moved with care, carrying small lanterns that sent narrow circles of light along the wooden floors. One by one, they opened the shutters of the king's chambers, letting in the faintest gray of the morning. Their first task was always the fire. Ashes were cleared from the great hearth, and new logs were stacked carefully to catch the spark. The yeoman leaned low, blowing gently until the flames grew steady. Heat spread slowly through the chamber, chasing away the chill that clung to the stone walls. Elsewhere, laundresses carried baskets of fresh linen through narrow side doors. The sheets had been beaten clean in cold water the day before, scrubbed with soap, and hung to dry in the smoky air of the laundry house. Now they were folded and crisp, ready for the king's bed and clothing. No one saw their faces in the grand halls, yet their work reached even the highest chambers. In the kitchens, the day had already begun. The first bell had rung in the small hours, calling cooks, bakers, and scullions to their places. The bakers leaned over heavy wooden tables, kneading dough with hands dusted white with flour. Great ovens glowed faintly, heat trapped within from the night before. Loaves would be ready by the time the court was awake. Farther inside, the spit boys turned long iron rods by hand, slowly and endlessly, so that meat roasted evenly. Even before the king had risen, the smell of smoke and fat filled the air. Scullions scrubbed pots with sand, fetched buckets of water from the well, and swept away the soot that settled with every fire. The kitchen never rested. Pages, barely older than children, hurried through the corridors carrying messages. One was sent to the armory, where smiths and armorers checked breastplates, polished helms, and sharpened blades. Another ran to the stables, where grooms fed the horses and brushed their coats until they shone. Each page knew the maze of hallways and courtyards as well as their own hands, for a message delayed could mean a sharp rebuke. The guards of the night watch stood aside as the daymen arrived to take their places. Spears were exchanged, helms lifted from weary heads, and the rhythm of duty continued without pause. The palace was never left unguarded, not even for a moment. In quieter rooms, clerks and secretaries sat at heavy desks, their ink pots and quills ready. They copied letters, recorded accounts, and prepared documents that would later need the king's eye and signature. Wax seals were stacked neatly in boxes, awaiting the royal mark. The scratching of quills was constant, the sound as much a part of the palace as footsteps and firelight. In the chapel, priests and choristers prepared for morning prayer. Candles were lit, their flames trembling in the still air. The sound of voices rose softly, chanting in Latin, the first song of the day. Their prayers were not only for the souls of the court, but also for the fortune of the king, upon whom the fate of all depended. Everywhere, the palace lived before the king himself had even stirred. Fires burned brighter, bread baked, horses stamped in their stalls, and papers filled with careful lines of ink. Each person, from the lowest scullion to the trusted yeoman, had a part in readying the day. And still, the great chamber remained closed. Behind its doors, the king slept, while dozens labored in silence to prepare the world he would wake to. At last, a knock at the great chamber door. The groom of the stool, the king's most trusted servant, entered quietly. His task was private, and though others whispered of it, none mocked his place. Few men stood so close to the king, and fewer still held such quiet influence. He saw to the most personal matters, ensuring the king's comfort, his health, and his dignity. Once the chamber was aired and the fire burned high, the gentlemen of the privy chamber entered. They moved with calm precision, laying out layers of linen and fine cloth upon carved chairs. Each garment had been chosen with care: fresh linen shirt, fitted hose, padded doublet, and the heavy gown of state. A chain of office lay ready to be fastened around the king's neck, polished until it caught the firelight. The king stirred, rising slowly. The groom of the stool attended him first, while the gentlemen waited silently. When that was done, the linen shirt was offered. The king raised his arms, and the shirt slipped over his shoulders. Hose were drawn up and tied. The doublet was pulled snug, each hook and cord fastened neatly. Nothing could be crooked or undone. The king's appearance was a reflection of his rule. While the gentlemen dressed him, others moved in and out of the chamber. The keeper of the wardrobe brought fresh gloves, perfumed and soft. The master of the jewel house arrived with rings and ornaments for the day's business. A clerk entered, bowing low, holding a list of matters that required the king's attention once he was ready. Even the food was prepared in careful ritual. A cupbearer entered with a goblet of wine, already tasted by another, to guard against poison. A carver brought a platter of meat, slicing it neatly before it was offered. Every bite the king took had passed through many hands, each sworn to loyalty. The barbers, too, had their part. A basin of warm water was brought, and sharp razors laid out. The king's beard was trimmed, his hair brushed and oiled until it shone. Mirrors of polished glass reflected the work. The gentlemen of the chamber stood ready with clean towels, folding them across their arms as though in a silent dance. Outside the chamber, the palace waited. Courtiers gathered in the galleries, whispering and jostling for position. Each hoped for a glance, a nod, or a word from the king when the doors opened. A moment of notice could mean favor, a gift, or even the start of power. But within the chamber, there was no rush. Each garment was tied, each jewel clasped, each cup tasted. The king's body was ready for the day, and with it, the whole court prepared to move. When all was in place, the gentlemen of the privy chamber stepped back. The groom of the stool gave a small bow. The king stood, fully dressed, the firelight glinting on rings and chain. The door would open soon, and the weight of rule would fall upon him. But in this chamber, for a few moments longer, it was only men at their duties, each role binding the morning into order. The heavy doors of the great hall opened, and the court began to stir. Sunlight slipped through the high windows, falling on polished floors and long wooden tables. The king entered, fully dressed, and the chamber doors closed behind him, leaving the gentleman of the privy chamber and the groom of the stool to return to quieter tasks. Pages and ushers moved swiftly, carrying messages from one corner of the palace to another. A note for the master of the jewel house here. A summons for the master of the wardrobe there. Their steps were light, but precise. For a single misdelivered message could mean disaster. In the hall, nobles took their places according to rank. Some bowed deeply as the king passed. Others whispered among themselves, hoping to catch the eye of a distant courtier. Every gesture, every glance, had meaning. The king watched little of it. Yet each person's hope and fear radiated in the air around him. Clerks and secretaries hovered near tables, quills ready. They copied petitions, recorded accounts, and prepared letters sealed with wax. Each signature, each notation, could change the flow of wealth, of land, or of favor. Their work was silent, but vital, invisible threads binding the court together. In one corner, heralds adjusted their coats and notes. They would announce visitors, record the arrivals of ambassadors, and remind nobles of proper etiquette. Every word carried weight, for the king's favor could hinge on ceremony and order. Meanwhile, the kitchen staff continued their work behind the scenes. Roasted meats, pies, and trays of sweetmeats were carried carefully to the tables. Cupbearers tested every drink. Carvers sliced meat with precision, ready to serve the king and those of highest rank. Their movements were smooth, trained, invisible to most, but essential to the order of the day. Outside, the palace corridors were alive with grooms preparing horses for the king or nobles who might ride later, falconers checking the hawks, and armorers polishing weapons. Each role intersected with the others, though no one spoke of it aloud. The palace functioned as a living organism, every hand knowing its part. The king settled at the high table. Gentlemen of the privy chamber hovered, ready to pour wine or adjust a cloak. Pages handed folded notes and petitions. Courtiers bowed or whispered, each hoping their presence would matter. For a moment, the hall seemed suspended. The weight of tradition, of service, and of history pressed quietly on every shoulder. Then, with a nod from the king, the hall came alive. Questions were answered, letters read, and messages sent on. The work of the court was steady, precise, and continuous. Outside the hall, servants carried new platters, swept floors, and refilled cups. A scullion passed through with a basket of bread for the tables, unseen but vital. The palace was alive with activity, yet all moved in harmony, each person fulfilling a role that kept the day flowing. Even as the morning wore on, the rhythm never broke. The king's attention moved from one matter to the next, while behind him, an invisible network of service and preparation made it possible. Each gesture, each sound, each silent movement was part of the story of life in the Tudor court. By midday, the hall began to empty, the courtiers retreating to private chambers, the clerks pausing only briefly to catch their breath. But the palace never truly rested. Kitchens, stables and corridors continued their quiet work. The fire still burned in the king's private chambers, and the palace awaited the next part of the day. Feasts, audiences, and the continuation of the endless dance of service. While the king presided in the great hall, another part of the palace labored endlessly, mostly unseen. The kitchens of a Tudor palace were vast, almost a world of their own, filled with heat, smoke, and the sound of constant work. To feed the king, his nobles, and the hundreds who followed them required planning, discipline, and dozens of different hands. The day began early. Long before the courtiers stirred, kitchen boys had stoked the fires in the enormous hearths. Great spits were turned slowly, heavy with sides of beef and venison. Pots bubbled with broths, stews, and sauces thickened with herbs. The smell of roasting and boiling mingled with wood smoke, clinging to the air and to every worker's clothes. At the center of it all was the master cook, who oversaw the whole operation. He directed the scullions, who scoured pots and scrubbed tables, and the assistant cooks, who chopped vegetables, prepared pastries, and basted the roasting meats. Bread ovens glowed red, their heat rising through the stone floor above. The bakers worked without pause, kneading and shaping loaves, from coarse rye for servants to fine white bread for the high table. Nearby, the buttery and the pantry prepared their own stores. The buttery kept the ale, the wine, and the beer, drawing each into flagons ready for the meal. The pantry handled the bread, slicing and arranging it on long wooden trenchers. Each department worked in rhythm, for when the time came, everything had to arrive in perfect order. In the scullery, boys carried buckets of water from the well, splashing it across the floors to cool the heat and wash away grease. The clang of knives against boards filled the air as carvers practiced steady cuts, for the king's meat would be presented in precise slices. The sergeant of the larder oversaw stores of preserved meat, cheese, and dried fish, keeping tallies to ensure nothing went missing. The poulterer checked over baskets of chickens, ducks, and geese. The spicery handled jars of pepper, cloves, and cinnamon, precious imports guarded as carefully as jewels. Each role was vital, each person a link in the great chain that kept the Tudor table full. When the hour of dining drew near, the noise of the kitchen grew. Pages hurried in and out, carrying messages from the great hall. The master cook gave his orders quickly, but calmly. The boys at the spits wiped sweat from their brows as they turned the heavy meat. The carvers sharpened their knives, testing edges on strips of cloth. The bakers brushed flour from their arms and pulled loaves from the oven, their crusts crackling. As the dishes were arranged, the spectacle of the feast became clear. Platters of venison roasted until golden brown, pies shaped like castles and ships, their crusts glazed until they gleamed, bowls of custards and marchpane molded into flowers, animals, and crowns, jellies set in brilliant colors, wobbling like gems upon silver plates. Even the vegetables were prepared with care, seasoned with herbs from the palace gardens. When the signal came, the procession began. Servants lifted the dishes onto broad trays, balancing them carefully as they left the heat of the kitchens for the cool corridors above. Cupbearers carried jugs of wine, already tasted for safety. Gentlemen ushers went ahead, clearing the path. In the great hall, all rose as the king prepared to dine. The dishes arrived in order, announced by heralds who declared each course. The carvers stepped forward, slicing the meat before presenting it to the king. Cupbearers knelt as they poured, ensuring the king's goblet never went dry. The nobles at the high table received their own portions, while servants and lesser guests were given simpler fare further down the hall. The feast lasted hours. Between courses, musicians played soft airs on lutes and viols, their notes mingling with the clatter of knives and the murmur of voices. Jesters moved among the tables, offering quick wit and small tricks. Pages stood ready, waiting for a glance or a nod that sent them running to fetch some needed item. In the kitchens, the work did not end. The scullions scoured pans as soon as they were emptied. More bread was baked, more dishes prepared for the next course. Dogs lingered by the doors, hoping for scraps, while cats prowled for mice in the shadows. The great machine of the palace never slowed, each part turning in time with the others. When at last the feast ended, the hall slowly emptied. Courtiers drifted back to their chambers, full of food and wine, still murmuring of politics and favor. The king withdrew to private rooms, attended by his closest servants. And in the kitchens, the fires were damped down, the ashes raked, the last pots scrubbed clean. Workers rolled out straw mats in the corners, too tired to climb the stairs to their own quarters. Tomorrow would bring another feast, another long day of chopping, boiling, roasting, and baking. For those who worked behind the splendor, life was steady, repetitive, but never without purpose. To feed the king was to serve the kingdom itself, and every loaf, every slice, every goblet carried held its place in the great order of Tudor life. Once the meal in the great hall had ended, the court flowed into its afternoon rhythm. The great dishes were cleared, the music softened, and the king turned his mind to other pleasures. For many, this meant the hunt. Outside the palace, horses were saddled, and hounds barked in their kennels, eager for release. The master of the hunt organized the outing, assigning grooms to lead horses forward and kennel boys to steady the dogs. Horns were polished, leashes checked, and spears carried out by yeomen. The king's own mount was prepared with care, saddle rubbed with oil, stirrups shined until they glinted. If the king chose falconry instead, the master of the mews took command. Hawks were unhooded, their sharp eyes blinking in the daylight. Falconers checked jesses and bells, while apprentices carried leather gloves and small morsels of meat to reward the birds. Each hawk was trained for years, every movement carefully judged. To hunt with them was not only a pastime, but a display of mastery and control. Not all joined the hunts. Within the palace walls, the afternoon offered other diversions. Courtiers gathered in chambers to play games of chance. Cards and dice rattled across tables. Wagers whispered, fortunes gained or lost in moments. For some, this was mere amusement. For others, it was strategy. A way to win the favor of a noble, or to bind an alliance with coin and drink. Music filled other rooms. Lutenists strummed soft tunes, while singers tried new verses of popular ballads. The gentlemen of the chapel royal, trained singers of the king's household, often rehearsed in chambers nearby, their voices weaving sacred harmonies that echoed down stone corridors. Visitors stopped to listen, carried away by the sound. Elsewhere, scribes and clerks did not rest. In quiet rooms, they bent over parchment, recording decisions, drafting letters, or tallying the accounts of the feast. The king's secretary carried bundles of papers in and out of chambers, his work as essential as any hunt or song. The kingdom itself was written in ink, line by line, sealed with wax and sent abroad. Ladies of the court gathered in chambers hung with tapestries, their own work spread across tables, embroidery, needlework, or the preparation of scented waters. They talked in soft tones, sharing news, repeating gossip, weaving the fabric of courtly life as surely as they wove their cloth. A laugh in one corner, a whispered warning in another. The rhythm of court politics moved as easily here as in the great hall. Outside, the gardens were tended by the master of the garden and his men. Herbs were clipped for the kitchens and apothecaries. Roses and lilies were pruned to bloom in perfect order. Some courtiers walked there quietly, taking in the air, speaking in low voices where no heralds could hear. To walk in the garden with the right companion could mean more than an hour in the hall. As the afternoon lengthened, the palace shifted again. The huntsmen returned, horns sounding as dogs yelped with pride, their muzzles marked with the day's kill. Horses were led to the stables, rubbed down by sweating grooms. Hawks were hooded once more and carried back to their perches, feathers smoothed and bells stilled. The spoils of the hunt were handed to the kitchens, where meat would be prepared for the next day's meal. By then, the palace glowed with a softer light. Torches were lit in the galleries, and fires rekindled in the great chambers. Servants hurried with trays of wine and sweetmeats, offering them to courtiers as they waited for the evening's entertainments to begin. The day's business was never truly done. There were still letters to be signed, petitions to be read, and whispers to be heard. But for a little while, the court turned its eyes to pleasure. Music, talk, and games filled the spaces between walls. And through it all, servants continued their quiet duties, unseen but constant, ensuring that every hour of the king's day flowed smoothly into the next. As dusk drew its curtain across the palace, the rhythm of the court shifted once again. The light from the high windows faded, replaced by the glow of torches set into iron brackets along the walls. Servants moved quietly through the galleries with bundles of rushes and baskets of candles. They trimmed wicks, replaced burnt stubs, and lit fresh flames, one by one, until the palace glimmered with a warm, flickering light. The air grew softer, less burdened with business and petition. After the clamor of the hunt and the shuffle of the day's duties, courtiers turned their attention to pleasure. For the king, the evening was not merely relaxation. It was a performance of splendor, a chance to display his power through culture, wealth, and magnificence. In the great chamber, a stage had been cleared. Wooden boards, laid across trestles, formed a platform where players would soon act their stories. The master of the revels oversaw it all, ensuring that costumes were ready, Lines were rehearsed, and every prop was in its place. The actors, members of traveling companies favored by the court, whispered among themselves, nervously awaiting their call. Before the play began, music filled the hall. The king's musicians, dressed in livery, tuned their viols and lutes. Sackbuts gleamed in the torchlight, recorders lay in careful rows, and the steady beat of a drum set a slow rhythm. When they played, the sound wrapped itself around the audience, a mixture of solemn hymns and lively dances that stirred courtiers to tap their feet, if not yet to rise and move. The performance itself might be a moral tale, filled with allegory, or a light-hearted comedy meant to raise laughter after a long day. Actors strode across the stage in painted masks and brightly dyed garments. Their words rang out beneath the vaulted ceiling, echoing against stone and timber. Courtiers leaned forward, smiling, whispering to one another, pointing at familiar jokes or clever lines. When the play ended, applause echoed through the chamber. Some nobles clapped gently, others shouted their approval. The king's reaction mattered most. A smile or nod from him could lift a company to lasting fame. The master of the revels watched closely, ready to adjust tomorrow's entertainment according to the royal mood. But the evening was not finished. After the play came the mask, a spectacle of music, dance, and disguise. Courtiers themselves sometimes took part, dressing in elaborate costumes with plumes and gilded masks. They moved in carefully rehearsed steps, weaving patterns across the floor. Behind them, musicians played on, their tunes rising and falling in harmony with the dancers. The gentlemen ushers directed the flow of the evening, guiding performers to their places, handing masks to courtiers, and ensuring that no misstep spoiled the grandeur. Torches smoked slightly as they burned lower, and servants moved among them to trim the flames, keeping the hall aglow. After the mask came dancing, less formal, but no less important. Courtiers stepped forward, one by one, to take a place upon the floor. The pavane, slow and measured, opened the sequence. Couples moved in time, bowing and rising, their feet gliding across the rush-strewn floor. Then came quicker steps, galliards and voltas, where partners spun and leapt, laughter spilling into the hall. The king might dance himself if he was in the mood. If so, the musicians would strike a special tune, and the courtiers would watch closely. To share a dance with the king was more than an honor. It was a chance for favor, a gesture that could lift a family for generations. Not all eyes were on the dancers. Some lingered at the edges of the chamber, speaking softly. Politics never truly rested, and an evening of music and laughter was also an evening of alliances. A whispered word during a dance, a brief exchange of glances across the floor, could mean more than a speech in the council chamber. As the night drew later, the mood grew gentler. Platters of sweetmeats were brought forward, marchpane shaped into intricate patterns, candied fruits, and sugared almonds in fine bowls. Cup-bearers carried fresh wine, always tasted before it touched the royal lips. The great hall grew warmer, the air thick with the mingled scents of beeswax candles, rose water sprinkled upon the floors, and the faint smoke of torches. The music softened, voices lowered, and the evening's performance came to a close. One by one, the torches along the walls were extinguished. Courtiers, their energy spent, drifted away to their chambers. Servants collected cups and platters, carrying them back to the kitchens. The musicians set aside their instruments, stretching tired hands. The king retired to his privy chamber, surrounded by a few trusted men. Outside, guards shifted their spears and settled in for a long night's watch. The palace did not fall silent. Not yet. Footsteps echoed in the galleries. The soft creak of doors marked the courtiers' return to their quarters, and the low murmur of servants finishing their duties lingered in the air. Yet a calmness settled, a sense that the day's business had been completed, the king entertained, and the court satisfied. The palace breathed a little slower now, preparing itself for the quieter hours that would follow. As the last of the torches were dimmed in the great chamber, the king withdrew from public view. The grand entertainments had ended. The courtiers had dispersed, and only a few trusted men followed him into the quiet corridors that led to his privy lodgings. This part of the palace was different. The noise and bustle of the court did not reach here so easily. The galleries were narrower, the ceilings lower, and the rooms more intimate. Only the most trusted attendants entered. The gentleman of the privy chamber, the groom of the stool, and a handful of others whose loyalty had been proven again and again. Inside the privy chamber, the fire had already been stoked high. Servants had laid fresh rushes on the floor, sprinkled with herbs to sweeten the air. Tapestries muffled the cold of the stone walls. The king's chair was drawn close to the hearth, and a small table held wine, fruit, and sugared almonds. The groom of the stool stood nearby, always ready to anticipate the king's needs. His role, though whispered about in jest beyond these walls, was one of the most powerful in the realm. He handled the king's most private matters, and with them, his confidence. Few men heard as many secrets or carried as much influence as this quiet servant who never left his master's side. The gentlemen of the privy chamber busied themselves in silence. One laid out the king's nightclothes, a long shirt of fine linen, a soft robe, and slippers to guard against the chill of the stone floor. Another poured a measure of wine, bowing as he placed it by the king's hand. A third checked the locks on the door, ensuring that no one might intrude without notice. The king spoke little at first, but when he did, those gathered listened with careful attention. His words might be idle reflections on the evening's entertainments, or sharp comments on a courtier's foolishness. They might be sudden orders, instructions for letters to be sent at dawn, or judgments on matters of state. The gentleman answered softly, noting every detail. The clerk of the signet might be called in, carrying papers for the king to review, even at this late hour. A flick of the quill, a blot of ink, and decisions were set that would shape the kingdom. Beyond politics, there was companionship. A favored musician might be summoned to play a gentle air upon the lute, filling the chamber with a quiet melody. Sometimes a trusted courtier read aloud, from chronicles or poetry, while the king rested in his chair. In these private hours, the courtly performance gave way to something slower, more personal, yet never without watchfulness, for every word spoken near the king was remembered. The servants of the chamber moved with ritual care. The cupbearer refreshed the goblet only after the taster had sampled the wine. The ewerer brought warm water in a silver basin, offering it with a clean cloth so the king might wash his hands. The barber stood ready, if trimming was required, his razors gleaming in the firelight. Each roll had its place, and each movement was part of the nightly order. When the time came to prepare for bed, the chamber grew even quieter. The gentleman folded away the king's rich garments, handling each with care. The groom of the stool assisted as the king changed into his nightgown. The great bed, draped with curtains of velvet, was checked once more. Servants examined the mattress, smoothed the sheets, and placed warming pans beneath the covers to drive out the cold. Guards stood just beyond the chamber door, their halberds in hand, their armor catching the torchlight. They would remain through the night, pacing in shifts, listening for any sound that might disturb their sovereign's rest. Outside in the galleries, ushers made rounds, calling the hour in hushed voices as they checked locks and bolts. Yet even in this most private hour, the palace did not fall entirely to silence. From the kitchens came the faint clatter of scullions washing the last pots. From the stables drifted the muted sound of horses shifting in their stalls. Somewhere, a watchman coughed, his footsteps echoing softly on the flagstones. The king's rest was wrapped in layers of labor, each person fulfilling a duty that guarded the night. At last, the chamber darkened. Only the glow of the hearth remained, casting long shadows across the rushes. The king lay within the great bed, curtains drawn, the linen smooth and scented faintly with lavender. The gentlemen of the chamber withdrew to their stools by the door, ready to wake at the slightest call. The groom of the stool lingered last, checking once more that everything was in order, before settling himself within reach. The palace exhaled. The rhythm of the day slowed. For the king, the long sequence of service, ceremony, and splendor had ended. For those around him, the vigil of the night had begun. While the king lay within his velvet-draped bed, and the gentlemen of the chamber sat quietly by the door, the wider palace did not sleep so easily. A kingdom could not pause, even at midnight. Instead, it shifted into a different rhythm. The corridors of Hampton Court and Whitehall were never entirely empty. At regular intervals, the watchmen passed along them, their boots echoing on the flagstones. Each carried a lantern to push back the shadows, and a halberd for protection. Some called the hour in low voices. Past 1 o'clock, and all is well, their words drifting through the halls like a chant. Their duty was vigilance, to keep the king safe, to prevent theft, and to guard against fire, the most dreaded of dangers in a palace heavy with timber and tapestries. In the outer courts, the yeomen of the guard maintained their posts. Wrapped in their scarlet and gold livery, they leaned on halberds and stamped their feet against the night chill. Even in darkness, their eyes swept across the gates, watching for intruders. The palace was a fortress as much as a residence, and its protection was never left to chance. Elsewhere, Work of a different kind continued. Down in the vast kitchens, the last of the day's scullions still toiled. Piles of trenchers, the wooden platters used at supper, had to be scrubbed clean. Iron pots, blackened with soot, were scoured with sand until they gleamed faintly in the firelight. The air smelled of ash and stale broth, and the floor was damp beneath their feet. For these workers, the night was a time of labor rather than rest. For the palace must wake again at dawn, with kitchens ready to feed hundreds. Beyond the scullions, in a quieter corner, the bakers began their shift. Their day started when most others ended, for the ovens required hours to heat properly. They worked by the glow of embers, kneading dough with flour-dusted hands, shaping loaves that would be baked in the early morning. The steady rhythm of kneading, the hiss of the fire, and the faint crackle of burning wood gave the bakery a pulse all of its own. In the laundry rooms, the laundresses bent over steaming tubs. By day, they scrubbed the clothes of courtiers and servants alike. By night, they rinsed and wrung fine linen belonging to the king himself. Candles flickered against damp walls as they worked in rhythm, their hands raw from soap and water. The palace demanded freshness each morning. Clean shirts, crisp collars, spotless tablecloths. And so the laundress's work rarely paused with the setting of the sun. Elsewhere, in chambers lit only by a single taper, clerks bent over parchment. These were the scribes of the secretariat, copying letters, drafting orders, and preparing reports to be placed before the king at dawn. Their quills scratched steadily, the sound sharp in the stillness. Drops of ink spattered the parchment, and sand was scattered to dry the words. For these clerks, the night was often the only time to work uninterrupted. Some nights, the royal physicians and apothecaries also remained awake, their chambers lined with jars of herbs, roots, and powders. Should the king or a favored courtier fall ill in the night, they were summoned at once. The faint smell of rosemary, sage, and vinegar clung to their rooms as they prepared cordials or syrups by candlelight. Their watch was quieter, but no less important, for sickness in the palace could spread quickly. Beyond the walls, the stable boys kept watch over the royal horses. They bedded down the animals with fresh straw, checked the water troughs, and rubbed the coats of the king's favored steeds. In the silence of the night, the horses stamped and snorted softly, the leather of their harnesses creaking in the dark. The stables, though far from the king's chamber, were as essential as any room, for a monarch's power depended on swift travel and strong mounts. All across the palace, the sounds of nighttime labor wove together into a tapestry of life. The steady drip of water in the laundries, the scrape of a quill in the clerk's chamber, the low thud of bread being kneaded, the muffled cough of a guard on head round. These noises did not disturb the king's sleep, but rather surrounded it, the hidden work that ensured his world was secure and orderly. For those who labored through the night, rest would come only when the palace stirred awake again. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the Thames, the watchman would call the hour one last time. The bakers would slide the first loaves from the oven, and the laundresses would hang clean linen to dry in the morning air. Then, while the court prepared for another day of spectacle and service, the night workers would finally retreat to their humble chambers, their labor unseen, yet indispensable. The palace had worked tirelessly from dawn to dusk, and even far into the night. Yet at last, as the moon climbed high and the candles guttered low, the pace began to slow. The watchmen still moved through the corridors, their lanterns swaying softly. But even their footsteps grew quieter, measured against the hush of sleeping chambers. In the kitchens, the last fire was banked, embers pressed gently beneath ash so that they might survive until morning. Scullions wiped their hands on rough cloths, stretching tired arms before slipping away to narrow pallets. Only the faint scent of smoke and broth lingered, drifting through the stone passages. The laundresses, their work done, wrung the last garments dry and spread them neatly. Steam faded into cool night air, and the sound of dripping slowed until only silence remained. In the bakehouse, the first loaves lay cooling on wooden boards, their crusts crackling faintly in the stillness. The bakers finally leaned back, resting flour-streaked arms on benches, their task finished just as the rest of the court still slept. In the stables, the horses shifted in their straw, blowing warm breath into the chill air. A stable boy leaned against the wall, eyelids heavy, listening to the slow rhythm of hooves on stone. Outside the walls, the Thames flowed steadily past, its waters glinting silver under the moon. Within the king's chamber, all was calm. The sovereign lay undisturbed beneath rich covers, while the gentlemen of the chamber dozed lightly in chairs nearby. A faint crackle of the hearth and the occasional sigh of shifting wood were the only sounds. The monarch, the heart of the court, rested securely, unaware of the countless hands that had labored to keep his world in order. As the night deepened, the palace seemed to exhale. The clamor of voices, the scrape of quills, the clang of pots and pans, all faded into memory. What remained were gentler sounds, the low hiss of an ember, the creak of timber beams, the distant lap of river water against the palace walls. Even the watchmen's calls grew softer, their voices hushed as though not to disturb the great building in its slumber. Slowly, the vast network of people and duties folded into stillness. The palace, which had pulsed with activity since dawn, now lay wrapped in quiet, every chamber settled, every role complete for a few precious hours. And so, in the final watch of the night, the Tudor court slept, the mighty and the humble alike, from king to scullion, from noble courtier to weary laundress, shared in rest beneath the same moon. The work would begin again with the first light of morning. But for now, the palace stood serene, its silence carrying the listener into calm and gentle sleep